Hello everyone, I think we will start now. So I'm Séverine Joanneau-Silarbi, I'm CEO of Tenerdis. Tenerdis is a competitiveness cluster on energy transition in Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes, and we support companies and public actors to work on innovation project and development and promotion of these collaborative projects. And I'm also a regional delegate of France Hydrogène in Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes. And I'm very pleased to have you here to have this conference. We are actually facing a climate emergency, as everybody knows. And there is an urgent need to decarbonate the energy and the economy in general. And hydrogen is an energy vector that is presented as one of the solution or part of the solution that could help us to meet such a challenge. And it needs to be produced decarbonated, and everyone thinks actually that the technologies are ready. The producer and consumers seems to be identified, and the industrial player also. So the main question that many people is asking themselves is decarbonated hydrogen as the time for mass production come. And to debate on that topic, I'm pleased to have here with me Tommaso Orlandini from EDP, that is leading the project Green H2 Atlantic, and Benoît Calatayud, that is the Director of Energy Transition at Capgemini Invent, Laurent Rivollet, that is the Green Gas Development Manager at GRDF, and Arnaud Berthet, that is the Director of Strategy and Development of Storengy. And so what I propose first for everybody is that each of you describe rapidly its own activities, entities, and the role that you have on this topic. So maybe Tommaso, you can start.
Thank you. And thanks for the invite to speak here today. So as Severine mentioned, I'm from EDP. EDP is a Portuguese energy utility that is leading the energy transition. As of today, we are present in about 28 markets, and we have an ambitious target to be coal-free by 2025 and carbon neutral by 2030. Which means that all of our generation will be from renewable sources. In 2021, so about 2 years ago, EDP created the hydrogen business unit, which goal is to ensure an integrated approach to supply renewable hydrogen, which is produced through electrolysis, sourced by renewable energies, and of course, the goal of this hydrogen business unit is to build on the track record that we already have in implementing renewable energy projects with a mix of different technologies, and as well as developing and requalifying our engineering competencies to develop and operate hydrogen projects. As Severine already mentioned, I come from the project development and execution team, which is inside the hydrogen business unit. I work as a project manager in this Green H2 Atlantic project, in which EDP is actually the coordinator of the project. Green H2 Atlantic has the goal to build a 100 megawatt electrolyzer capacity to produce renewable hydrogen, so produce from renewable energy sources. And the 100 megawatt electrolyzer will be installed in Sines, which is located in south of Portugal, in the former coal power plant owned by EDP, which has been recently decommissioned. And so we are, let's say, finding a new purpose for the assets that we already have. I will also, actually in the afternoon, I will also introduce more and tell more about the project and eventually I will have also the opportunity today to say a bit more. And thanks again for the invite.
Benoît?
Yes, thanks for the invitation. So I'm Benoît Calatayud from Capgemini Invent, which is a part of strategy and organization of the group Capgemini. So Capgemini is a huge group, as you may know, more than 350,000 people all over the world in more than 50 countries. We have a role in hydrogen. We help our clients and our future clients to develop low carbon hydrogen from with an end-to-end assistance. We provide this end-to-end assistance from the strategy with Capgemini Invent to the industrial and operational development, because we have another part of the group called Capgemini Engineering. It's Altran. We bought Altran actually 2 years ago. And we can provide some technical and digital help and assistance to our clients and future clients to develop hydrogen. And I think we will have interesting talks about it, because I think today in 2023 we are at the stage of the strategy to the industrial and operational to go at scale in hydrogen. So there is a strong need to go from the strategy, roadmaps, public and private fundings, to the industrial and operational deployments and developments.
Hello everybody. First, sorry for my English, is a little rusty. But anyway, I am from GRDF. GRDF is the main natural gas distributor in France. My job is mainly to integrate more and more green gas or renewable gas in the network, mainly from methanization, but also gasification and power to methane. So why I'm here for hydrogen? Because in the same times we are looking for to put a specific distribution network for hydrogen. Why hydrogen? Because when you look at different scenarios to decarbonate the natural gas, hydrogen is roughly 25% of the solution for decarbonation. And we believe it will be mainly for industrial and heavy mobility. So that's why we are looking at this. And when we look specific at the distribution network, what is the roles of a distribution network? We see two steps in the development of a distribution network. First, it's around 2030. We will have a small network which will connect producer and consumer on few kilometers, which will avoid to have a tube trailer to transport this hydrogen. So that's the first steps. On the second step, it will be when Portugal, Spain will produce a lot of hydrogen. You will have a big transportation pipe, which called a backbone, hydrogen backbone, which will go through Europe. And here it will be the opportunity for the distribution network to make some branches to go to deliver hydrogen on smaller customer, and also to get new sources of production of hydrogen, small production of hydrogen, like you have more and more solution to storage hydrogen on excess of electricity, renewable electricity through electrolyzer, and you can store hydrogen. So we have the opportunity to take this hydrogen, and also you have the opportunity to build hydrogen, to make hydrogen from the biomass with new technology like gasification and pyrolysis. You see different processes which are under development now, and these usually are smaller production, so perhaps it will be interesting to connect it. And the good thing about this new technology it's you are not dependent of the electricity price, and you are creating value from waste. So it could be interesting. No. So now, GRDF, how do we work on a distribution network? First, we have done a project in Dunkirk, which was called GRID. It was to test the blending of hydrogen in the natural gas network up to 20%. So we tested, we know it works. There is no problem as far as a network to integrate hydrogen in the natural gas. The big problem, it's more on the end users, because you have different gas with different calorific value, so it could make perturbation on the industrial use or on the mobility use, which is not very well accepted currently by the customer. That's why now we think it's more adapted to do a specific hydrogen network. In the same times, we are developing our own platform to test hydrogen-ready equipment for the network and to train our people. And we plan to do two first demonstration before 2026 of hydrogen distribution network.
Thank you, Laurent. Arnaud?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Arnaud Berthet. I'm from Strategy. This is a fully owned company by NG Group, and we are dealing with underground gas storage. So for the last 70 years, we have been developing and operating underground gas storage sites mainly in France, UK, and Germany. So today we operate 21 underground sites, of which 14 are in France. So the role of storage, so in the natural gas, that's really to bring flexibility to the system and security of supply. Just to give you an idea, for the natural gas in France, you can store the equivalent of 25% of the annual consumption of the whole France in natural gas. And in winter, it represents 50% of the consumption. So that's really key to ensure the continuity and the security of supply. So in the same way the storage can play this role for the natural gas, it will play the same role for hydrogen when the market develops. So you will need tools to get a flexible system, to get security of supply. And in addition, as it was mentioned, green hydrogen will be produced from renewables. You know that most of the renewables, mainly PV and wind, are intermittent, so they are not available all the time. So you need to also to manage this flexibility, and storage will be there to make sure that your final customer will have continuous supply when the production can be intermittent. And as well, what we see in terms of flexibility need on the electricity system, that sometimes for the renewables in particular in summer, you can have excess of production. Too much electricity from solar, for instance, when the consumption is low. And then instead of curtailing the production, you can store this additional excess electricity in the form of hydrogen and then feed it back later on when you need electricity in winter, for instance. So storage will definitely play a key role in the development of the hydrogen market in France and in Europe. And Strategy, now we are engaging into developing hydrogen storage project. So we have several projects in the 3 countries I mentioned, France, UK, and Germany. And only in France, we have our very first project that was started in 2020, which is called Hipster. It's to develop a first storage in a salt cavern in est-elle. It's near Lyon. And that's the first large-scale demonstration project of storage of hydrogen in Europe, with the ambition to demonstrate the feasibility and the technical requirement to safely operate storage in the underground. And we have a second project which is developed on the Manosque storage site. It's in the southeast of France. And there recently we launched an open season to test and sound the market and who is possibly interested by storage of hydrogen. And we had very good responses from the market players on both sides, from the producers, so developers of production projects who wants also to have some kind of backup and have a use of storage, but also that's interesting on the consumer side. So you have large-scale consumers, particularly in the area of Marseille-Fos, heavy consumer of hydrogen, who are willing also to turn into green hydrogen, and they also want to have security, flexibility in the way they can also supply their own hydrogen. So definitely that's a new way for development for Storengy and fully engage into this new market.
Thank you very much for this short presentation of your activities. And now has the time arrived? So that's the question we need to try to answer together. And what are the current obstacles to the massive production of hydrogen? What are the levels of action? We identified roughly 3 main issues together in preparing this conference. The technological issues, the market issues, and the regulation and infrastructures issues. So first on the technical issues, we know that renewable hydrogen is systematically or mostly associated with electrolysis, which can be detrimental to processes using biomass or other materials in the deployment of public policies. How do you see the coexistence of these different renewable hydrogen production processes, and what about the technological maturity of these different processes? Which one to start?
Yes, I can start just to begin about the going at scale of the production. Maybe to say that today, hydrogen is largely produced for industrial uses. It's the demand exists today, but it's a carbonized demand, and it's produced with natural gas, as we all know today. And in Europe, you have 11 billion of tons of hydrogen consumed per year. So the demand exists again. So we are at a stage to shift this demand to low carbon demand. So we don't come from nowhere. And one of the main challenges, but we will go to it after, is to open this demand and to access to this industrial demand, which is again very huge because it's used today in the fertilizers and the refinery, for instance. So maybe it's the first things I wanted to say. Today, the hydrogen is not something to decarbonize our economy. So the main objective is to develop a new market of low carbon hydrogen produced with renewables or mainly decarbonized electricity, so with the nuclear in France. About the technical aspects, there is different maturity, of course. Electrolysis is not a recent thing. It has been developed a long time ago. And we see that today the electrolyzer is mainly the most promising tool to produce low carbon hydrogen, but we see a lot of technical issue to produce electrolyzer at scale, especially in Europe and especially in France. It's quite difficult to develop some factories to produce reliable electrolyzers today. So maybe the first thing is to say that there is a lot of difficulties in terms of technical aspects to produce at scale electrolyzers. Again, on the whole value chain of hydrogen, there are some technical issues, especially for tanks for the mobility. It's quite difficult to develop again some special tanks for hydrogen, so there are a lot of technical issues. And also on the fuel cell, to produce a large-scale capacity of fuel cell, some megawatts, it's quite easy to produce some small capacity fuel cells, but again, when you go at scale, it's difficult to develop some large gigafactory to produce this kind of components. So there are large scope of difficulties from electrolyzers to end users with few cells and tanks. So there are a lot of innovation again to go from TRL maybe 8 or 9 to 10 or 11. And with the other tools to produce hydrogen, such as thermolyze, for instance, as you mentioned with biomass, it's very interesting, and I think the public support needs to be on electrolyzers to produce gigafactory, but also needs to encourage other kind of production, such as thermolyze. But there are a lot of things to do to go from TRL, maybe from 6 to 7 for thermolyze to 10 or 11.
Thank you, Benoit. Tommaso, you want to tell more, on especially on big electrolyzer, maybe?
Yeah. So I wanted just to take the opportunity to maybe mention some numbers just to give an idea. The Europe set a very ambitious hydrogen strategy. I believe the goal is to have a demand of 20 megatons by 2030, 10 of which needs to be generated in Europe. And to give an idea, the goal of Greenwich to Atlantic project is to install 100 megawatt electrolyzer that would produce 10 kilotons, so 1,000 times less than the demand that will be installed. I think another interesting aspect also to connect with what you mentioned is that it is evident with this ambition and also to fulfill the existing demand of hydrogen, which today is mainly the so-called gray hydrogen, is to scale to the gigawatt size of. Mainly I'm referring to electrolysis, but probably there might be also other technologies. Today, to my knowledge, the biggest electrolysis plant under operation is around 20 megawatt. So there is still a long way, let's say, to develop and to also demonstrate. And then I think there is also another important aspect that might be relevant, is that those electrolyzers not only will need to be demonstrated at scale, but will also need to be demonstrated in operational conditions. And as of today, let's say the regulation for green hydrogen and the definition of green hydrogen is not entirely clear. But what is clear is that we will need to produce green hydrogen from renewable sources, which make a lot of sense. But renewable sources are intermittent. So the electrolyzer will need to operate very flexibly. And at scale, and this flexibility is something that has not been tested at scale yet, might create some challenges in the development of the technology, from let's say ramping up in a proper way to follow the generation of renewables, as well this one might cause some issues, for example, in the degradation of the electrolyzer, which is something that today is still not clear in operational condition, which would be the degradation, but also some other technical characteristics of the electrolyzer.
Do you want to complete? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to add on what was said, when we're talking about massive production, that's the topic of the panel today, we're talking about hundreds of megawatts of installed capacity and eventually gigawatt scale. And today we're at the stage where, okay, we, for instance, in France, the projects that you can see, they are supported by ADEME, for instance. They are for the mobility sector mainly, and we're talking about megawatt, 1, 2, 3 megawatts. And when you develop this kind of projects, when you need to transport, for instance, your production of hydrogen to your consumption point, okay, you use a truck and you have a series of truck commuting from the production site to the consumption site. That works when you have small capacity, small volumes to transport. But when you talk about 100 megawatt or even more than this, it's just not feasible anymore. Economically, it doesn't make sense. So you need also to build the infrastructure that will allow for transportation and storage of large quantities of hydrogen. and not only regionally, even though it may start like this, and we see, for instance, in the Netherlands that you have first projects of pipelines to connect consumption point to production, but you might, I mean, you must have heard about the Inframed project, for instance, between France, Portugal, and Spain to transport massive amounts of hydrogen from regions where you can produce it at a low cost because you have low electricity price in Spain and Portugal, and then to transport it throughout Europe to the main consumption points or areas like north of Germany or Netherlands. And this, you need large infrastructures. Today, the technology to develop those infrastructures are there. We know how to build pipelines. We know how to build storage. Storage of hydrogen is not something new. It exists in the UK, for instance. It exists also in the US. So we have, as an industry, experience in this. But we need to go further because today the storage that has been developed is just to store and keep it there for security of supply. Tomorrow, you will have a flexible system to implement, in particular because there is intermittent renewable electricity. So you need, in addition to flexibility in the electrolyzer, also have flexibility to store hydrogen. And to store, meaning that you inject and you withdraw. For natural gas, usually you do it one cycle a year, meaning you inject in summer and then you withdraw in winter because the natural gas is used mainly in France for heating. So the demand is high in winter. For hydrogen, it will be different because the end consumers are not so much the residential people who needs hydrogen to heat. No, it's more the industry. And the industry has more flat consumption. And intermittency of the renewable energies will require that you need to cycle much more your storage. You need to inject and withdraw much more. And this is something new for storage. So we need to experiment how it can work, how much compression, for instance, we need, what type of material, of equipment, what kind of steel we need. And that's something which is ongoing. And that's something that at Strategy we're testing with the hipster project I referred to earlier. So, as it was said, we're not starting from scratch, from zero. Things are existing already. We have an experience, but we need to go further if we want to reach a massive production of hydrogen in the years to come.
Thank you, Arnaud. I don't know if you, Laurent, you want to add something or?
Yes, just a small thing, like Arnaud said, technically for the infrastructure, it's not a big problem because we know how to transport with pipe the hydrogen. After, which is more complicated, we have to integrate this in the urban area. And the hydrogen is much more risky than natural gas, so we need to have rules to on the regulation rules to know exactly what we have to do. So that's the first thing that as a distributor we need. And another thing, it's when you put hydrogen in a pipe, you have at the on the user side, you have different kind of hydrogen. If you use it in medical or in some process, you have different quality of hydrogen. We need also to have standards to be fixed at the European level to say what are the hydrogen that we could transport in a pipe.
So I suggest now we can go through the second issue, the market issue, and especially I think it's not sufficient clear today the market issues, the opportunities to use the hydrogen, and also the economic model around this. What is your advice on this topic?
Yes, maybe about the market, it's quite interesting because there is no market today. Actually, there is no organized market in hydrogen because it's a commodity such as gas or electricity. So there is no organized market. All the transactions are OTC. So there is a challenge to create or to develop a hydrogen market at the European level, national level, or regional level, at least with a pilot or a test in a first way, to develop a transparency framework to find hydrogen and to know exactly the price and behind the cost of low carbon and carbon hydrogen, and to be clear on what's carbonized and what's not carbonized, because today it's very difficult to have these informations. And maybe once it will be done, and maybe in parallel, we have a main challenge to support and to develop the competitiveness of low carbon hydrogen with a contract for difference, and that's what we made in renewables. And I think it's a really good tool to develop low carbon hydrogen. It's not yet done in France and in Europe, and I think the European Commission needs to be clear on this topic, because it's very important. We have a lot of support on CapEx, but not on OpEx in another way, in another world. So it's very important to set up clearly in the short term this kind of mechanism, because as you know, in the United States we have the Inflation Reduction Act, with a strong support on the operational production, with in maximum of support of $3 per kilogram of hydrogen. And so we need something similar in France and in Europe in general to develop the market and the low carbon hydrogen.
I just wanted to add a few more points. So first of all, also the contract for difference is not in place in Portugal as well, and I agree with you that it's important today. I mean, it is evident that renewable hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen is not competitive yet with grey hydrogen, for example. So to actually develop projects, we don't only need support for CapEx, which is already in place in Europe, but also for the OpEx. And then going back to the market issue, I just wanted to add maybe being a project manager, we have been, let's say, studying different setups of projects, and what we believe in EDP is that first the initial use, which I think you already mentioned, at least in the short term, the use of hydrogen needs to be in the hard to electrify sectors. There are several sectors that can be electrified, and we don't believe that in the short term hydrogen should be the solution. While there are others, mainly in industrial processes, where they are hard to electrify, either for let's say technical reason, or either because it is not cost effective. So we believe that it's important to focus on those sectors first, and then eventually moving to other ones. Then another challenge that we have already been discussing is the transmission and the infrastructure to transport hydrogen. It is not in place yet, so in the short term what we believe is that so first of all, as we already mentioned, there is the need to demonstrate at least 100 megawatt scale electrolysis in operational environment, and in the short term what we believe is that the hydrogen production needs to be close to the end user to mitigate a bit the, let's say, the transmission additional cost, which is not only a matter of technology, but well, actually it's mostly a matter of that the infrastructure is not in place, because the technology, as far as I know, is mature and is not an issue on that side. So in short, we believe that the target, at least in the short term, the initial target should be hard to electrify sectors, and also that projects that needs to be developed in the short term should be close to the end users to reduce costs. I mean, today it's much easier to transport electricity rather than hydrogen. So I believe it's more important to have an end user close by rather than, for example, a renewable plant that is next to the hydrogen, to the electrolyzer. I mean, of course, in this speech, I'm mostly focusing on electrolysis, not other technologies. But I thought it would be important to mention it.
Maybe a few more words. We have no structured market today, and you could even say there's no market for the green hydrogen. basically because the demand cannot meet the offer, or the other way around. And why that? Because today, green hydrogen is very costly. You have a very high price. It's almost 10 times more than the gray hydrogen. So when you're a factory where you consume hydrogen, if you don't want to lose your competitiveness against your competitors, then you cannot afford to multiply your hydrogen price by 10 times. And at the same time, on the production side, if you want to deliver a cheap or low-cost hydrogen, green hydrogen, then you need to go for a large scale. A large scale means large investments, and then you need to have some security on your offtake. Who is going to buy your hydrogen to make sure that your investments, you can get the return over the 20, 30 years that will last your assets. So it's very difficult today to make the match between the offer and the demand. And to make it, that's what was mentioned there, you need to have the political willingness to put in place the market tools, the market design that will allow to bridge the gap, meaning that it can be affordable for the consumer to consume green hydrogen, and it can be affordable from a risk perspective for the producer, the investor, to invest into an asset to produce hydrogen. And that can be mechanisms like contract for difference. We have at EU level initiatives, also guichet in French, to apply to submit your projects to get subsidies, capex subsidies or opex subsidies. But that's at the, I would say, the European level. It needs to be cascaded down to the national level, and the legal framework is not there yet. Even at the European level, you still have some delegated acts, for instance, still to be approved to really set what's the status of the green hydrogen. Is not that clear, as you mentioned, and that's true. And down at the national level, it also needs to be implemented. So you have regulation to be put in place to make sure that the market can be triggered, kickstart, and in terms of supporting the market by the political authorities, it's either to incentivize the production through subsidies, or also to incentivize the demand through quotas, for instance. And you see it for green gas in the transportation, mobility sector, where RED II directives impose some quotas on the distributor of fuels, and they have, again, if they're not, they pay penalties, they have to include in their mix green advanced biofuels, for instance, and hydrogen can be part of it. So it's all those tools put together by the political or policymakers that will allow this market to trigger.
I want to add something a little different. It's an operational point of view. When I meet investor in this hydrogen production, we see that the distribution network could help them in their business model in two ways mainly. First way, it's when we meet some project developer which want to build gasification process from biomass. They have two opportunities. They can make hydrogen or green methane or green natural gas. And very often, what they plan to do, we will see what they will really do, but what they plan to do is to first start with natural green biomethane. Why? Because the quantity is there. So they have the opportunity to build a large quantity of green natural gas and to inject them in the network because they are the need. So that's a first help. And very often they plan in the same time to switch to hydrogen when the need will be when the quantity needed will be more important. So that's the first need. And when I speak with people who want to develop electrolyzer, the network could be the opportunity to go to take more smaller customer on an area, but which will help them to have a bigger electrolyzer, so they have a scale effect, on which will allow them to have a lower price. Not sure that it's correct and you understand everything, but il y a un effet d'échelle, scale effect.
Yeah, maybe to add something about the market, and you said it, when we produced low carbon hydrogen with electrolyzers, we need electricity, of course, and we know that we will need a lot of electricity up to 2030 for many things, and especially for mobility, for instance. So we have an issue on this, and I think it's a very strong issue, especially for this year and the next year, again, to go at scale and to connect offer and demand in low carbon hydrogen. We see two main sectors with a very high potentials for low carbon hydrogen. It's steel and it's fertilizers. But still, we see a lot of projects, and especially in France with Gravity and ArcelorMittal. And we know that this kind of project will need a lot of electricity and low carbon electricity, and close to the gigawatt. So it's about one nuclear reactor. So there is an issue to develop and to secure for them a competitive low carbon electricity with, for instance, some corporate PPAs, but also with a good market design with long-term contract and at the European level with the MIX, for instance, a long-term contract over 3 or 4 years, up to 15 years. But there is an issue on this low carbon electricity. For fertilizers, we see the same, but it's maybe quite different because we see the value chain all over the world, and we see some very huge project of hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen, for instance, in Chile or in Australia, and they want to produce hydrogen and export hydrogen with ammonia, for instance, and to answer the demand of for the fertilizers. So it's two markets with a quite different value chain, but one main thing is for the steel, we will have a strong issue in Europe, at least if we want to produce steel in Europe and in France, we need to secure a lot of quantity of low carbon electricity. So the market design needs to be adapted, especially with corporate PPA and the whole market design. So it's a main issue, I think, on the market. But with a strong potential to decarbonize the economy, because as you know, steel and fertilizers emit a lot.
Okay for this issue? Yeah. So maybe now the last one, to link consumption and production, we need the infrastructures. You said that before, and the regulation associated. So that's the last point we will address. It's in spite of existing plans, actually, it seems anyway that there is no clear position on the subject of the public policies, and in France and at European level, it starts to move, but it's not complete, sufficient to allow a rapid investment and to deploy the hydrogen infrastructure rapidly. So what is your view on that, and what you would suggest, maybe?
It's true that when you are investing in an infrastructure, whether it's a transmission pipeline, distribution network, or storage, first it takes time. You don't build a pipeline or a storage in 1 or 2 years. And this is an investment that will last for 40, 50 years for storage, maybe a bit less for pipelines. So you need to be sure as an investor of what will be the market conditions that will secure your investment. And today, for the natural gas sector and for the electricity sector, the infrastructure business is regulated. In France, you have CRE, Commission de Régulation de l'Énergie, who is the regulator to define the rules for the infrastructures. And there is this question whether the hydrogen infrastructures should also be regulated or not. So it's not decided yet at the European level. It seems that the Commission is pushing for regulation. We don't know yet for the the member states and the parliament, but it's pretty likely that it will come because regulation is a way to set the visibility and the rules for the investor to secure your investment. If there's no regulation that can secure this, it will be very difficult to invest. And the sooner the better to know whether it's going to be regulated or not, because as I said, it takes time to develop an infrastructure. For storage, for instance, if you reuse existing storage, it will take between 3 to 5 years to develop a storage. If you start greenfield, it can take up to 10 years. So if you want by 2030 to be ready, then you better start now to do it. So at Strategy, that's what we're doing. We start developing, but we know that we will not take an investment decision until we know exactly what the framework will be to make sure that the investment will be economically viable. So the regulation will be key, as mentioned, first at the European level to set the same rules for all countries and then translate it into each national framework.
Yes, I'm 100% agree with what you just said. For instance, like I told you, GRDF want to experiment 2 networks for 2026. We know we will not have the regulation to do it. And it's a problem because we need, we are going to do, bon, it's a first investment, so it will be smaller, but we need to have the visibility to see if there is a business model behind it. And as a natural gas distributor, we are convinced that that's the best solution for everybody. Because when we will start to build a network, if it's a public, if it's a public distribution network, everybody could be connected to this network. So we will have a common infrastructure which will be shared by everybody. And that's the best solution to reduce the cost of the logistic of hydrogen. So we, as natural gas, well, it's difficult to say differently, but we don't see the better solution than public system, service system.
I just wanted to add one comment connected to regulation, and I think is also connected to what I mentioned before. So there is not a clear, or maybe it's more appropriate saying a final definition of what is renewable hydrogen. There are already some options. There is, let's say, a semi-final structure, but it is not clear yet. And maybe coming from an energy utility, what we realize is important is, I mean, to produce renewable hydrogen, you need a lot of renewable energy. For example, in Green H2 Atlantic project, to have 100 megawatt of electrolysis installed, we believe we need more than 200 megawatt of renewable energy installed between wind and solar. And also, a big part of the cost of green hydrogen comes from the cost of the electricity. And if the definition of how to produce renewable hydrogen is not entirely clear, I can give an example. So today, let's say the most strict interpretation of the RED II directive and delegated act is to source electricity from new built renewable sources, which means that you need to build new facilities. You cannot use already existing ones. And also that there need to be a correlation between the hydrogen produced and the electricity source of 1 hour, which means that in every hour, to make sure that you are producing renewable hydrogen, you need to make sure that 100% of your electricity is renewable. And if you are connected to the grid, this one needs to be done mostly through power purchase agreements, or at least this is what we are investigating so far. But for example, there are also less strict interpretation of the renewable of the RED II and delegated act, which means that the match between the hydrogen you produce and the electricity that you source is on a monthly basis. This one might don't seem a big difference, but in reality, in the way you operate the plant and also in the way you source and you secure the renewables, the new build renewables to power the electrolyzer and produce green hydrogen, it makes a big difference. And so it changes the economics and gives uncertainties to the project. So I think it's already happening in some projects that they are delaying FIDs. I think recently, I don't want to name the specific projects, but they clearly mentioned that they delayed their final investment decision due to uncertainty in the regulation. So I think it's of course one of the challenges that we identified, and I think it's quite an important one.
Okay, maybe I have a last question for you. I know that you are not, you cannot predict the future, but for you, when for this mass production? At which horizon do you see that? Each of you, one word?
Well, we have, let's say, the hydrogen strategy set by the European Union, right? So, let's say our goal is to meet that those targets, and I mean, besides regulation and some other aspects to which, of course, we need help. I mean, probably it's let's say a view from a project manager. But what I believe is that we need to, at least for the production of hydrogen, and of course in transmission and storage also is important. But in general, what we need to do is put in place projects. We need to validate the technology and scale up to show that the technology is ready and actually the market is responding to, let's say, the different inputs and in terms of capex in the case of EU, and also to meet those targets.
Yes, it's a difficult question, but I would say 2030 for the low carbon hydrogen at scale, because we see a strengthening of the decarbonization of some industrial processes, and especially steel and fertilizers, as I said. So I think the strong demand for this decarbonization aspect will be decarbonized in 2030, but not before, with the technical, economical, and environmental issues we mentioned. I think, but we will see.
I think when we look at what's happened the last years with the Russo-Ukrainian war, when Europe wants something, we can do it, and we can do it fast. So it's mainly a question of regulation on the money, but we have both. So I think it could go very fast.
With my head of infrastructure operator, I would say if you want to go for massive production, you need infrastructure. And you need time to build the infrastructure. So I would say in the next decade, in the 2030s, you can really reach massive production, meaning hundreds of megawatts of capacity installed.
Thank you. So it's tomorrow, almost tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. I think we can thank the panelists. I don't know if you have time for one or two questions or...